The lunch shift at the Hamilton Grill was always brutal, the kind of place where business deals were brokered over overpriced steaks, and where the staff wore forced smiles as armor against the casual cruelty of Manhattan's elite. Among the clatter of cutlery and murmurs of stiff conversations, Ava Carter moved between tables with practiced grace. At 32, she was invisible to most of the diners, until they noticed the scars. Thin, jagged lines traced the length of her arms, peeking out from beneath the crisp white sleeves of her uniform. A burn mark curved over her collarbone, disappearing beneath the edge of her apron. Most days, Ava kept her head down, delivering drinks, taking orders, avoiding eye contact. But that afternoon was different. It started at table 9. 3 men in tailored suits, the kind who spoke loudly about mergers and used waitstaff like props in their personal performances, barely acknowledged her presence. The tallest of them, a man with an expensive watch and a cruel smile, reached for his whiskey as Ava leaned in to clear the plates. His eyes lingered too long on the scars. "Jesus," he muttered, loud enough for his companions to hear. "They let you work front of house looking like that?" A ripple of laughter. The other 2 men snickered behind their napkins, eyes flickering from Ava's arms to her face, searching for the damage. Ava kept her posture steady, though she felt the familiar tightening in her chest, the heat crawling up the back of her neck. She placed the empty glasses onto the tray, fingers steady despite the tremor in her throat. "Maybe she's one of those burn victims they parade around for diversity points," the second man chimed in, smirking. A third added, "Should have kept her in the kitchen where no one has to see it." The manager, a thin man named Greg with prematurely graying hair and a tendency to avoid conflict like the plague, was watching from the bar. His gaze flickered between Ava and the suits, then away, pretending not to hear. Standard procedure. Keep the high-paying clients happy. The staff could deal with their own bruises. Ava turned away from table 9 without a word. She moved to the service station, set down the tray, and took a steadying breath. The restaurant's artificial coolness prickled against the patches of scarred skin exposed to the air. It wasn't the first time. It wouldn't be the last. But at table 6, someone was watching. An older man, heavy-set, with cropped gray hair and a weathered face, his hands thick with age and experience. He hadn't touched his burger. Instead, his gaze followed Ava's every move with an intensity that was almost unsettling. Ava noticed him only when she passed by to refill his water. "Excuse me," the man said, his voice rough but steady. She turned, half expecting another comment, another joke. But he simply pointed to her wrist. "That tattoo," he murmured. "What unit?" Ava froze. Her instinct was to cover the faint ink barely visible beneath the web of scar tissue. A small symbol, a half-obscured dagger crossed with an olive branch, encircled by Latin words faded with time and damage. She hadn't thought anyone would recognize it. Most didn't. Most didn't even look. It was a long time ago," she replied, defensive without meaning to. The man's eyes softened. 5th Tactical Med Evac. Kandahar. 2010, right? Ava's breath caught. She hadn't heard those words in years, and certainly not from a stranger in a New York steakhouse. She nodded once, her voice a whisper. "Yeah." The man sat back in his chair, visibly shaken. "I knew it. Damn. Thought I was losing my mind." From the corner of the restaurant, the laughter at table 9 rang out again. One of the men mimed a flinch and shouted, "Careful, you'll catch something." Ava clenched her jaw, willing herself not to respond. The older man's gaze followed the sound. His expression darkened. He reached for his wallet, dropping a pair of crisp hundreds on the table. "Listen," he said, standing slowly, joints cracking. "You don't know me, but my name's Samuel Brooks. I was a staff sergeant in that same goddamn unit. We left good people behind out there. I'm sorry it took me this long to find one of them." Ava blinked, not trusting herself to speak. "You ever need anything, you call me." He pressed a card into her palm. "Don't let those bastards tell you who you are." As Brooks made for the door, the restaurant fell into an uneasy hush. Ava stared down at the card. A number. A name. and beneath it, a simple line. We take care of our own. The callousness of Table 9, the indifference of management, the years of carrying her scars like a burden instead of a badge. In that moment, none of it felt quite as heavy. If this story of injustice and transformation moved you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more stories that turn pain into power. The air in the restaurant remained thick with an uncomfortable tension long after Samuel Brooks left. The laughter at Table 9 had subsided, replaced by low murmurs and glances that flickered toward Ava, and then quickly away. It was the kind of silence that followed a spectacle, one where the audience pretended not to have watched, even though every pair of eyes in that room had seen. Ava moved through it like a ghost, clearing plates and refilling water glasses, feeling the heat of unspoken words brushing against her skin. Her scars, always a quiet presence, now felt like they screamed with every step she took. She was gathering empty salad bowls from Table 4 when one of the men from Table 9 called out again. "Hey, waitress!" Ava's grip tightened around the tray. She inhaled, turned on her heel, and approached the table. The man, the tall one with the watch and the poisonous grin, lounged back in his seat, a whiskey glass in hand. "You missed a spot," he said, pointing toward a barely visible stain on the white tablecloth. The others snickered. Ava leaned down, swiping at the non-existent mark with a damp cloth. She kept her face blank, her hands steady. She'd long ago learned the art of containment. But the man wasn't done. He made a show of studying her arms, his gaze lingering where old burns met healed knife wounds. "Jesus Christ," he said, loud enough for half the room to hear. "What did you do, fall into a bonfire or something?" The table erupted in cruel laughter. Ava straightened, the cloth clutched tight in her fist. She felt her pulse thrum at her temple, a familiar tide of humiliation rising. Someone at Table 2 gasped. A young woman in a tailored dress shifted uncomfortably in her chair. A server passing by flinched but said nothing. And at the bar, Greg, the manager, pretended to be absorbed in his phone. Ava opened her mouth. To say what, she wasn't sure. But the man cut her off, leaning in with a smirk that made her skin crawl. "Bet you scare the kids on Halloween, huh?" His words hung in the air, heavier than the scent of grilled ribeye and old money. A single brittle moment where the entire restaurant teetered between complicity and decency. Before anyone else could react, a voice from near the entrance rang out. "Hey!" Everyone turned. Samuel Brooks had returned. He stood in the doorway, his eyes sharp and hard, a storm behind them. In one hand he held something small and weathered, a dog tag, its chain coiled around his thick fingers. He walked back toward Table 9 with the deliberate, unhurried stride of a man who had marched through gunfire and lived to tell about it. The room seemed to shrink around him. The man in the suit raised a brow. "Who the hell are you?" Samuel didn't answer. He turned to Ava instead. "I need you to do something for me," he said, his voice low, carrying. "Take off your wristband." Ava hesitated. The thin leather strap she wore there was more than just an accessory. It was a shield. But something in Brooks' expression, a steady, almost defiant kind of empathy, made her fingers move. She undid the strap. The faded tattoo beneath was clearer now, its ink distorted by scar tissue but unmistakable to those who knew. The dagger, the olive branch, the numbers, 518 TCME. Ava heard the sharp inhale from somewhere nearby. Cough that might have been a choked-off apology. Brooks turned back to Table 9. "That symbol," he said, "belongs to a medic unit that pulled civilians and soldiers out of burning hellholes, while you assholes were sipping drinks in air-conditioned boardrooms." He tossed the dog tag onto their table. It clattered against a plate, the name etched into its surface, catching the light. Lewis Carter. "My brother," Brooks said softly, "died in her arms in Helmand Province. She got caught in the same blast, took shrapnel, burns, nerve damage, and still carried 5 men to the evac site. The restaurant had gone deathly still. Now you sit here running your mouths, mocking someone whose courage you couldn't match on your best goddamn day. The men at table 9 didn't laugh this time. The tall one's grin faltered and the others stared at their plates like schoolboys scolded in front of the class. Brooks took a step closer. You owe her more than your silence. You owe her respect. A beat. Then, from somewhere in the back, a slow clap. It was Tomas, one of the line cooks, a Dominican immigrant who rarely ventured onto the floor, but whose eyes now glistened as he applauded. One by one, others joined. The young woman at table 2, a middle-aged couple near the window, a busboy wiping a glass. Ava stood motionless, the echo of the applause vibrating through her chest like a heartbeat she hadn't realized she was missing. Greg, still at the bar, seemed to deflate. His mask of indifference cracked, revealing something close to shame. He cleared his throat. "Mr. Brooks, I think it's best if you—" Brooks cut him off without turning. "You'll be hearing from the Veterans Council about your hiring practices, Greg. And maybe a few journalists, too." He faced Ava again. "You've got nothing to hide," he said quietly. "Nothing to be ashamed of. And if you ever need backup, you've got it." He extended a hand. Ava took it. And for the first time in years, the weight of those scars, the visible and the hidden, felt a little lighter. The moment Samuel Brooks left for the second time, the atmosphere in the Hamilton Grill shifted, as if an invisible storm cloud had finally lifted. The scattered applause had faded, replaced by a dense, uneasy quiet. Even the ever-present hum of conversations seemed to hesitate in the wake of what had just transpired. Ava stood near the server station, clutching the tray she didn't remember carrying. Her heart was pounding not from fear or anger this time, but from something unfamiliar, the fragile, tenuous warmth of recognition, a validation she hadn't allowed herself to hope for in years. "Are you okay?" Tomas asked gently, sidling up beside her. The cook's weathered face was somber, his accent softening his words. Ava gave a small, wavering nod. Yeah, I think I am." The door chimed again. A man in his mid-30s stepped inside, scanning the room. Tall, dark suit, sunglasses, but not the predatory confidence of a corporate shark. He had a clean military cut, the kind that never quite grows out even years after discharge. His gaze settled on Ava, and he made a direct line for her. She tensed instinctively. Another stranger. "Miss Carter?" he asked, his voice low. "Yes." He pulled a leather wallet from his pocket and flipped it open, revealing a badge. Department of Veterans Affairs. "Name's Malcolm Ellis. Sam Brooks sent me." Ava's brows knit together. "Already?" Ellis gave the hint of a smile. "He's fast when he's pissed." Before Ava could respond, Greg appeared beside them, his expression a carefully practiced combination of concern and opportunism. Is there a problem here?" Greg asked, darting a nervous glance at the badge. "Not unless you want to make one," Ellis replied smoothly. "I'm here on behalf of the National Veterans Equity Commission. Your employee here's been listed as unacknowledged combat personnel. According to records, she's entitled to benefits, medical care, and recognition she never received." Greg blanched. I wasn't aware. That's part of the problem." Ellis cut in sharply. "No one was." Ava's stomach dropped. The words sounded surreal in the open air of the dining room. She hadn't heard anyone call her combat personnel since the night the medevac chopper lifted her from that ravaged Afghan valley, her uniform soaked in blood. Some hers, some not. "But I wasn't enlisted," Ava said quietly, to Ellis more than anyone else. "You were a civilian contractor under military authority during an active conflict," Ellis explained. "Under Federal Statute 38 U.S. Code Paragraph 101, you qualify. And those injuries—" He gestured to her arms, his tone careful but devoid of pity. "They're combat service related." Ava's throat tightened. "They told me. When I got home, they said it wasn't enough." Ellis's expression hardened. They were wrong. By now, the restaurant staff had gathered discreetly nearby, curiosity pulling them in like moths to a flame. Even the customers were pretending to eat while eavesdropping. unable to resist the weight of real history intruding on their polished world. Greg's face paled further. "Listen," he stammered. "Whatever misunderstanding there was—" "No misunderstanding," Ellis cut in, producing a slim envelope from his jacket and handing it to Ava. "You're scheduled for a formal commendation ceremony next month." Sam pulled strings. "The VH wants to correct the record." Ava stared at the envelope as if it might vanish if she blinked. "But there's more," Ellis added, lowering his voice. "Your unit's records were flagged last year in a corruption probe. Some of those contractors you served with, they've been trying to get their benefits restored. Your testimony could help a lot of people." The word struck Ava deeper than any insult ever could. Her testimony. A chance to turn the years of being dismissed, ignored, forgotten, into something that mattered. She cleared her throat, blinking away the sting behind her eyes. "Yeah," she said softly. "I'll do it." A flicker of something like pride passed through Ellis's gaze. He nodded once. Before leaving, Ellis turned to Greg. "You'll be getting a call from my office about discrimination complaints. We'll be pulling the employment records for the last 5 years. Might want to have a lawyer handy." Greg's lips parted, no sound emerging. Ava almost pitied him. Almost. Ellis offered one last glance at Ava. "We take care of our own." Sam wasn't exaggerating. And then he was gone. Ava stood there a moment, letting the enormity of what had just happened settle over her. Around her, no one spoke. Some averted their eyes. A few looked changed. Tomas finally broke the quiet. You gonna stay here?" Ava looked around the restaurant, at the gleaming bar, the linen-draped tables, the patrons who treated her like furniture, the manager who'd stood silent through every insult. "No," she said, a small, calm smile tugging at her lips. "I think I'm done taking scraps." She untied her apron, folded it neatly, and laid it on the counter. Then she picked up the envelope, tucked it into her pocket, and walked toward the door. And for the first time in years, her scars felt like something earned. The early evening air was thick with the sticky heat of late summer, but Ava Carter barely noticed it as she stepped out of the Hamilton Grill and onto the crowded sidewalk. The city moved around her as it always did, indifferent, unrelenting. But for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel swallowed by it. She walked aimlessly at first, the envelope Ellis had given her pressed against the fabric of her jeans like a pulse. She didn't dare open it yet. Not on the street. Not while her hands still trembled and the weight of what had just happened hovered over her like an unspoken promise. She turned a corner into a quieter street and leaned against a brick wall, letting herself breathe. The sounds of taxis and hurried footsteps faded behind her. She closed her eyes, but the images came unbidden. Smoke, screams, the sharp tang of blood thick in the air, the burning heat of searing metal against skin, and the weight of Lewis Carter's head in her lap as he gasped for breath in the dust. Ava opened her eyes, blinking hard. She wasn't there anymore. She was here. And there was something about the way Samuel Brooks had looked at her, not with pity but with recognition. That unraveled a knot she hadn't known was still tied. The faint buzz of her phone in her pocket pulled her back to the present, an unknown number. She almost ignored it, then thought better. "Hello? Ava Carter?" A calm, clipped voice on the other end asked. "Yes." "This is Julia Langston, Deputy Director at the Veterans Equity Commission. Sergeant Brooks briefed me on your case." The woman spoke with an air of precise authority. "I wanted to reach out personally. What you experienced, both overseas and since returning, is part of a wider pattern we've been working to dismantle." Ava didn't know what to say to that. "I appreciate that," she managed. Langston's voice softened. "Your record was buried, Ava. There was a conscious effort by certain contractors and military personnel to minimize civilian casualties and suppress reports from evac medics during that operation. Some of your fellow contractors have been missing from official logs for years. Some never received the benefits or recognition they earned." Ava's stomach twisted. She knew their names, had seen their faces, people like Malik Harris, Lena Duarte, old Doc Sandoval, ghosts she'd thought no one else remembered. "We're reopening those files," Langston continued, "and we'd like you to testify." Ava exhaled. The enormity of it pressed down on her. Not out of fear, but the weight of long-buried obligation. "I'll do it," she said quietly. "They deserve that." A pause. Then Langston added, "Also, Sergeant Brooks asked me to tell you he's organizing a memorial service for your unit next month. At the old Armory Hall on Lexington. He thought you might want to come." Ava's throat tightened. Yeah, I'll be there." They exchanged a few more logistical details before the call ended. Ava slid the phone back into her pocket and took a deep, steadying breath. This was happening. She made her way home to her modest apartment on the 5th floor of a pre-war walk-up, the kind of place where the plumbing rattled and the windows stuck in summer. But it was hers. She tossed the envelope onto the worn kitchen table and opened it with care. Inside was an official letter from the Department of Veterans Affairs, confirming her eligibility for benefits, medical care, and back pay she'd never expected to see. And beneath it, a second sheet, an invitation to the commendation ceremony. Recipient: Ava Carter, 5th. Tactical Combat Medical Evacuation Unit. Commendation for Valor and Service, to be presented by the Secretary of Veterans Affairs. Her fingers traced the lettering. She allowed herself a small, unguarded smile. A knock at the door startled her. She wasn't expecting anyone. Cautious, she peered through the peephole. A delivery guy, holding a small, unmarked package. She opened the door. "Ava Carter? That's me. Delivery from a Samuel Brooks." The man handed it over and left without waiting for a tip. Ava brought the box inside and opened it on the table. Inside was a simple, battered metal bracelet, the kind worn by medics in the field to identify blood type and rank. Hers. She hadn't seen it since that night, lost somewhere in the chaos of the battlefield. Alongside it, a single note in thick, careful handwriting. "We don't leave our own behind. SB." Ava's vision blurred, but she refused to cry. Instead, she slipped the bracelet onto her wrist where it belonged, and for the first time in years she felt whole. The scars would never leave, the past would never change, but she wasn't invisible anymore, not to them, not to herself. Outside the window, the city kept moving, but Ava Carter was no longer lost in its current. She had found her way home. The following week passed in a strange, suspended haze. Ava Carter moved through the days as if some invisible veil had been lifted. Things that once felt heavy, lingering stares, whispered remarks, her reflection in the mirror, no longer cut as deep. They were still there, of course. People don't change overnight. But now she had something else. Something they couldn't touch. Her name back. The recognition of what she'd endured, what she'd fought through, what she'd lost. At night, though, the ghosts came. The dreams were always the same. Dust and smoke curling into a dark Afghan sky, the low drone of choppers overhead, the pulse of gunfire like a second heartbeat, the screaming, the smell of burning fuel and charred flesh. And Lewis Carter, no relation though the shared name had drawn them close, bleeding out in her lap trying to give her his dog tag, refusing to close his eyes. She always woke before she saw the end. It was on the 4th night that the old nightmare shifted. This time, in the dream, as she crouched in the sand and cradled Lewis's head, someone appeared beside her. A tall figure in battered fatigues. Samuel Brooks. He knelt down, hand steady on her shoulder, and instead of the endless desert, behind him was the faint outline of a city skyline. New York. When she jolted awake, the lingering image stayed with her. This time she didn't feel trapped beneath it. This time, it felt like a message. The next morning, her phone buzzed with a text from Malcolm Ellis. Memorial service confirmed. Sunday at 1500 hours, Lexington Armory. Brooks asked for you to speak. Ava stared at the message, her pulse stuttering. Speak? Her instinct was to refuse. She wasn't good at public displays. Words failed her more often than not. And what could she possibly say to a room full of people carrying their own grief? But another message followed. You're the only one left who was there when Louis died. He deserves to be remembered by someone who gave a damn. No pressure. Ava closed her eyes. She knew what she had to do. The Lexington Armory stood like a stubborn relic of another era, its stone facade weathered by time and graffiti. Inside, the hall had been cleared and lined with rows of folding chairs. The American flag hung heavy at the front, beside a projection screen already cycling through faded photographs of young faces in uniform. Some smiling, some forever frozen in profile, eyes scanning distant horizons. Ava arrived early, still unsure if she'd stay. But the moment she stepped inside, the quiet washed over her. Not empty, not sterile. This quiet was a presence in itself, a kind of reverence that made even the old fluorescent lights above seem softened. Malcolm Ellis found her by the entrance. "You made it," he said, offering a rare, unguarded smile. "I wasn't sure I could." "You didn't have to, but you did. That matters." She looked around. A few people had gathered already. Older men and women in plain clothes, though their bearing spoke volumes. Military posture didn't vanish with age. A couple of younger faces, too, people she didn't recognize but could guess were from families connected to the old unit. And there, near the front, was Samuel Brooks. He turned as if he'd felt her gaze, and the weight of his look stopped her breath. There was no pity in his expression, only pride. She crossed the hall toward him. "Didn't think you'd chicken out," he said, voice low but warm. "Thought about it," Ava admitted. "Good, shows you've still got sense." They shared a small, understanding smile. "I found a few more," Brooks said, gesturing toward a cluster of older vets nearby. "People who served with Louis. People who remember what happened out there." Ava swallowed. "I didn't think anyone cared." "They didn't want you to believe they did," Brooks corrected, his gaze darkening. "But some of us, we never forget our own." He reached into his pocket and handed her something, a small bronze medallion on a faded ribbon. It was Louis's unit citation. "He'd want you to have it," Brooks said. Ava took it, the metal cool against her palm. She didn't cry, not yet. A hand touched her arm, another face and another. People whose names she barely remembered but whose faces were burned into her bones. And one by one they thanked her, for saving a brother. For surviving, for coming back, for speaking when no one else would. When Malcolm Ellis called her to the small makeshift stage, Ava's legs felt unsteady. The microphone hissed softly. Dozens of faces turned toward her, but this time the stares didn't shrink her. They held her up. She spoke about Louis, about fear, about the way the system made people like her disappear when they became inconvenient. About the scars she carried, not just on her skin but the ones they tried to carve into her silence. And how that ended now. When she finished, the room was silent. No applause, just a solemn, collective breath. And then, one by one, they stood. It wasn't for her, not entirely. It was for Louis, for the unnamed medics and contractors who never got medals, whose stories never made the news. Ava stood a little straighter. She wasn't invisible anymore. After the service, people lingered, unwilling to break the fragile spell of the gathering. Ava found herself surrounded by faces she hadn't seen in over a decade, and strangers whose eyes carried the same weight of loss. Some brought photos, others old, creased letters. A few clutched dog tags on worn chains. The language of their grief was unspoken but instantly understood. It was there, amid the quiet conversations and shared memories, that Ava met Lena Duarte's mother. A short, sharp-featured woman in her 60s, with hair that had once been jet black but now shimmered silver. She held a faded photograph of her daughter in uniform, bright-eyed, wide grin, one hand curled around a medical bag. "You knew her, didn't you?" the woman asked, her voice steady. Ava's throat constricted. "I did." The woman nodded, eyes brimming but unbroken. You're the one who carried her to the evac site. They told me later, said I shouldn't know. But I knew. Ava reached out, took the older woman's hand. There was nothing to say that could patch over years of government silence, of letters that never came, of truths buried beneath redacted reports. She fought to the last, Ava whispered. I know, the woman replied, and so did you. Ava felt the tremor in her grip, but it wasn't weakness, it was resolve. I watched that video, you know, the older woman said, her eyes narrowing. The one at that restaurant. I saw what they did to you, and I saw you stand anyway. My girl would have liked you. Ava didn't realize she was crying until the tears blurred her vision. She squeezed the woman's hand once more, then stepped back, unsure she had the strength to hold anything heavier in that moment. She wasn't sure how long she wandered after that, offering a few words here, a brief embrace there. Faces blurred together, the air felt thick with history and things left unsaid. She found Malcolm Ellis by the rear exit, phone in hand, issuing orders to someone in a voice so calm and precise it felt surgical. He glanced up when he saw her. We did some digging, he said without preamble. After your testimony, doors opened fast. Records we weren't supposed to have. Payment logs, deployment lists, assignment authorizations. Turns out your entire evac team was intentionally omitted from the official after-action reports. Ava's stomach twisted. Why? Because 2 weeks after that operation, a private security contractor, Allied Force Solutions, filed a patent on battlefield trauma equipment based on methods your unit improvised in the field, and they didn't want any surviving witnesses contesting intellectual property claims. Ava's jaw tightened. She remembered the name, Allied Force Solutions, the same logo on the chopper that left them in the valley. The same corporation that refused to pay hazard bonuses after half the team didn't make it home. You're saying they buried us to steal our work? Ellis gave a grim nod. And the Department of Defense turned a blind eye. Too much money on the table. A bitter laugh escaped Ava's lips. It wasn't funny, it was obscene. But somehow it felt almost inevitable. What happens now? She asked. Ellis hesitated. That's where it gets complicated. The statute of limitations on most of the financial claims has expired, but the discrimination, the medical neglect, the omission of your records, those are actionable. Ava's gaze hardened. Then let's act. Ellis allowed himself a brief smile. Already in motion, Brooks has contacts in the press. There's a reporter from The Atlantic doing a piece. It'll blow wide open next month. He reached into his jacket and handed Ava another envelope, heavier this time. What's this? Evidence, Ellis said. Official records, testimonies, photographs, it's yours now. Ava ran her thumb along the edge of the envelope. Inside was proof of every betrayal she'd spent a decade trying to forget. I don't want it buried again, she said. It won't be, Ellis promised. You'll decide where it goes. They stood in silence a moment longer, the weight of unspoken things pressing in. Then, a voice called out from across the hall. Ava! She turned. It was Brooks waving her over. We've got one more thing, he said, gesturing toward a table where a handful of older vets were gathered, holding something wrapped in a weathered military flag. Ava approached, curiosity gnawing at her. Brooks motioned to the bundle. We pooled together. Thought it was time you had this back. One of the vets unwrapped the flag, revealing a field medic's badge, her badge, polished clean, the engraving restored. Ava stared down at it, her breath catching. She hadn't seen it since Kandahar. Thought it lost with everything else in that valley. The inscription read, Carter, A 5th Tactical Combat Medical Evacuation Valor in the Face of Fire. A lump formed in her throat. This was never theirs to take, Brooks said quietly. Ava's fingers brushed the metal. The badge wasn't heavy, but the history it carried was. She lifted her chin and met the gaze of the men and women around her. I'll wear it this time, she said, voice steady, and I won't let them forget again. The next morning, Ava Carter woke before dawn. The city outside her window was still hushed, The usual drone of traffic and blaring horns replaced by a delicate, almost reverent quiet. She sat at her kitchen table, the envelope Malcolm Ellis had given her resting before her like a sealed confession. She knew what was inside. She could feel it in the weight of the paper. For years, she'd lived like a ghost, moving through crowds, her scars and armor in a prison all at once. She thought she'd buried her past deep enough that no one could drag it into the light again. But Samuel Brooks had, and it was time. She peeled the envelope open with steady fingers. Inside, a thick stack of documents. Deployment orders with her name, incident reports, casualty logs with redacted names she knew by heart. Photos of the aftermath. Sand-blasted vehicles, blood-soaked bandages, the cratered landscape of that long-forgotten valley. At the very bottom, a letter to Ava Carter. From Office of the Secretary of Veterans Affairs. It was an official apology, acknowledgement of her service, her injuries, and the administrative error that had led to the omission of her medical and military records from the archives. An error. Ava laughed, a sharp, humorless sound. That was the word they used for burying lives, for erasing blood and sacrifice. Still, as hollow as the words read on paper, it was something. Proof. A wedge she could drive into the rotten heart of the system that discarded people like her. Her phone vibrated. A text from Brooks. "Today's the day. You ready?" She didn't hesitate. Always. By noon, Ava stood outside a midtown federal courthouse, a modest press conference assembling beneath a cluster of hastily erected canopies. A few journalists she didn't recognize. A couple of local reporters she did. Malcolm Ellis was already there, giving a statement off to the side. A camera crew adjusted their angles. And beside the podium stood Samuel Brooks, dressed in a dark suit that looked both too formal and exactly right for him. He caught Ava's eye as she approached. "You sure about this?" he asked. "No," she admitted, "but I'm doing it anyway." Brooks grinned. "That's how you know it's worth it." Ava took her place beside him as Ellis stepped up to the microphone. "Good afternoon," Ellis began, his voice crisp and commanding. "We are here today to address a long-buried injustice, not just against Ava Carter, but against dozens of civilian medics and contracted personnel, whose sacrifices were erased by a system designed to forget them." Murmurs swept through the small crowd. Ellis continued, laying out the timeline, the hidden records, the stolen innovations, and the corporate profiteering by Allied Force Solutions. Each revelation struck like a hammer. Some reporters typed furiously, others whispered into their phones. Finally, Ellis stepped aside and gestured to Ava. The world seemed to narrow as she approached the microphone. Her reflection shimmered in the courthouse's mirrored doors behind the crowd. Scarred arms, determined face. The woman she'd become. "My name is Ava Carter," she began, her voice steady, clear. "I was a medic with the 5th Tactical Combat Medical Evacuation Unit in Kandahar 2010. I carried men and women out of firefights, patched them up in field tents, held their hands when there was nothing else I could do." A brief hush fell over the gathering. "I was injured during an extraction mission," she continued, glancing at the jagged scars on her arms. "And when I got home, they erased me. Told me my service didn't count because my contract wasn't official enough. My wounds weren't visible enough. My name wasn't important enough." Ava's gaze swept over the reporters, the veterans in the crowd, the young woman in a wheelchair near the back whose face flickered with recognition. "They buried us to make room for profit, and they left the rest of us to clean up the pieces." She reached into her pocket and pulled out Lewis Carter's dog tag, holding it up for the cameras. "This belonged to a man who died trying to save others. His name deserves to be remembered, and so do all the others." A brief silence hung, and then Brooks began to clap. Slow, measured. One by one, others joined. The applause built into a steady, defiant rhythm. For the first time in a decade, Ava Carter didn't feel like a ghost. She felt like a soldier. Later that evening, the story broke across major news outlets. Veteran erasure scandal exposed. Private military profiteering at the expense of civilian medics. The report named names. It detailed payouts, falsified records, and the patent theft of field medical techniques developed by Ava's unit. Allied Force Solutions stock plummeted 27% by market close, and at the Hamilton Grill, Greg watched it all unfold on the tiny kitchen TV, his face pale. A notice from corporate landed in his inbox minutes later. Suspended pending investigation. Elsewhere, across the country, veterans and their families watched the news with quiet fury and vindication. Ava's inbox filled with messages, some from old unit mates, some from total strangers. You spoke for us. I thought no one would ever remember. You gave us our name back. She read everyone, and for the first time since Kandahar, Ava slept through the night. The days that followed the press conference rippled like aftershocks through circles far beyond Ava Carter's old unit. What had begun as a reluctant testimony, coaxed by Samuel Brooks and Malcolm Ellis, had become a national conversation. News programs dissected the scandal nightly. Journalists uncovered layers of rot that stretched deeper than anyone anticipated, quietly implicating military contractors, VA officials, and lobbyists whose influence had stifled any attempts to hold them accountable. Ava watched it all from the sidelines, not out of fear but choice. She knew her voice had value now, and she meant to use it carefully. By Friday, the Department of Veterans Affairs formally announced an internal review of cases involving unacknowledged civilian contractors. It was damage control disguised as compassion, but it was something. Names long erased were beginning to surface. Ava sat by her apartment window, the envelope of records still on her kitchen table. Across from her, a letter had arrived that morning, thick, cream-colored, and formal, from the office of the Secretary of Defense. She hadn't opened it yet. Her phone rang. Samuel Brooks. You watching this circus? He asked. Ava glanced at the muted TV where a politician deflected a reporter's question about the Allied force contracts. I am. You did this, you know. Ava huffed a small laugh. Not alone. Still matters they're scared, and scared people make mistakes. She heard something in his voice. Satisfaction edged with caution. We've got one more move, Brooks said. And I want you in the room for it. Ava's pulse ticked up. What is it? An executive session hearing, private, off the record for now. House Subcommittee on Military Oversight. Ellis is testifying, and they want you there. Ava hesitated. Ava, Brooks said, his voice softening, this doesn't have to be about revenge, it can be about repair. She closed her eyes, weighing the years, the pain, the scar tissue that never fully healed. Then she nodded, knowing he couldn't see it but trusting he'd hear it in her voice. When? Sunday, 0800. I'll be there. The federal building's secured hearing room was windowless and cold, all government functionality and no soul. A long oak table stretched across the space, a row of congressional staffers and committee members seated at its head. Malcolm Ellis stood at the witness table, crisp in his suit, as steady as a soldier on parade. Ava entered quietly, guided by Brooks to a seat behind Ellis. She recognized two of the men on the committee from the evening news. One had made a career grandstanding about patriotism while quietly gutting VA budgets. Ellis began his testimony, recounting the buried reports, the suppressed casualty figures, the patent theft, the targeted erasure of civilian medics. Every point was backed by documentation. Ava watched the faces across the table harden, some with guilt, others with barely concealed fury. Then Ellis gestured toward Ava. Miss Carter is here today as one of those erased. The room shifted, all eyes on her. Ava stood slowly. No microphone this time, no cameras, just the weight of a dozen powerful men and women waiting for her to speak. I'm not here to be your symbol, she said. I'm not here for your headlines or your regrets. I'm here because you let people like me be discarded, so someone else could profit. One congressman opened his mouth to object, but she cut him off with a glance. I carried men out of burning vehicles. I held their hands when they called for mothers who weren't coming. I was left behind, stripped of name, rank, and recognition, because acknowledging me was inconvenient to your balance sheets. A hush settled over the room. I buried friends in unmarked graves because nobody filed the paperwork. And while you filled your pockets, we filled body bags. Someone shifted uncomfortably at the far end of the table. I came here today to tell you this. We are not invisible. We are not expendable, and you don't get to forget us anymore. A long, hard silence followed. Then a woman seated near the end of the committee, her hair graying at the temples, leaned forward. "Miss Carter," she said quietly, "on behalf of this committee and this government, I'm sorry." Ava's lips twitched into something resembling a smile. "Don't be sorry," she replied. "Be better." And then she sat down. That afternoon, Ellis sent her a text. "It's done. Full review ordered. Names reinstated, benefits processed, patents contested." Ava allowed herself a moment to exhale. Later that evening, she returned to the same Lexington Armory where the memorial had been held. A small gathering this time. No press, no government faces. Just people who mattered. Brooks was there, along with Lena Duarte's mother and a handful of old unit vets. They'd framed Lewis Carter's recovered dog tag, placed it in a glass case beneath the unit's patch. Ava traced the glass with her fingertips. "You did good," Brooks murmured beside her. Ava looked at the memorial, then at him. "We did." The sun dipped below the city skyline, streaking the sky in bruised colors. Somewhere below, life kept moving. Cab horns, sirens, people hurrying home. Ava Carter stood a little taller in its shadow. This wasn't the end, but it was the reckoning they said would never come. It was strange, Ava thought, how the world could continue so indifferently in the face of seismic change. In the days after the hearing, the city's pulse beat on. Coffee shops filled, subway cars rattled through tunnels, rooftop bars hummed with laughter. And yet for those caught in the storm Ava had helped to ignite, nothing felt quite the same. News broke in waves. Allied Force Solutions issued a statement full of hollow deflections and legal jargon. But it came too late. Investigative pieces published names, payments, and records that could no longer be denied. Several executives quietly resigned. A congressional inquiry into private military contractors' influence on policy was officially opened, a proceeding no one had seen coming 6 months before. And through it all, Ava Carter's name surfaced again and again. The scarred waitress who stood up, the medic they tried to erase, one woman's fight against silence. Some of it made her bristle, the reduction of a decade of loss and survival into digestible headlines. But the messages that found her inbox and doorstep made it worth enduring. A letter from Malik Harris's sister in Houston. A phone call from Doc Sandoval, now running a free clinic in New Mexico. An email from a young woman named Renee, a former contractor in Syria, who'd seen Ava's press conference and finally filed for her benefits. It rippled out, further than Ava could have predicted. Not justice, not entirely. The wounds were too deep, the system too vast, but a reckoning nonetheless. On a rain-heavy evening a week later, Ava met Brooks at a tiny bar in Harlem. No frills, no white tablecloths, just worn wood, old photos on the walls, and music that remembered how to bleed. They sat in a booth near the back where the light hit the table like an old friend. "You look different," Brooks said, tipping his glass toward her. Ava smirked. "Less invisible." He raised his glass in a small, rough salute. "You did what most people wouldn't," he said. "They made you carry the silence for a decade. You carried it, and then you broke it. That takes more than brass. That takes marrow." Ava took a sip of her whiskey. "Wasn't alone." Brooks shrugged, a rare glimmer of humility in the old soldier's weathered face. "We don't do alone anymore." The door creaked open behind them and Malcolm Ellis stepped in, a folder tucked under his arm. He made his way to their table, nodding in greeting. "Thought you might want to see this," he said, sliding the folder toward Ava. She opened it, flipping through pages dense with legal language. A court settlement notice. Allied Force Solutions had agreed to a payout, not just to her, but to 42 other forgotten medics and civilian contractors. Retroactive benefits, official commendations, public acknowledgement of service-related injuries. It wasn't total justice, but it was official. It was on paper, and it was public. Ava looked up, her throat tightening. "You serious?" Ellis nodded. "Filed this morning." Brooks exhaled a soft, humorless laugh. "Son of a bitch. Never thought I'd see the day." Ava closed the folder carefully, like a relic too valuable to damage. "What about the patents?" Ellis gave a crooked smile. "Pending court challenge, but with the media heat and congressional pressure, it's a matter of time." The weight of those words settled over Ava like something solid and unfamiliar. Closure wasn't the right word. The dead didn't come back, and the scars didn't fade. But vindication, a reckoning, that could exist. She raised her glass. To the ones who didn't get to see this. Brooks and Ellis joined her. 3 mismatched survivors in a bar built on old stories. They drank. And when the whiskey burned its way down, Ava felt something loosen in her chest, the knot of grief she'd carried alone for too long. "I got a job offer," she said after a moment. Brooks raised an eyebrow. "Yeah?" "Ellis's commission wants someone to head up a new outreach program. For contractors, medics, people like us." Ellis smiled faintly. "Figured it ought to be someone who knows what the hell they're talking about." Ava stared into her glass, considering it. The old ache of fatigue wrestled with a new, tentative pull. It would be work. Hard, thankless, frustrating. She'd be fighting a system designed to resist her, but she was good at that. "Tell them I'm in," she said. Ellis clinked his glass against hers. Brooks grunted approval. They sat in companionable silence after that, 3 ghosts no longer content to haunt their past. And outside, the rain came steady against the city, cleansing the streets of old sins. Ava Carter, scarred and unbroken, was finally done waiting for permission to exist. The months that followed saw Ava Carter stepping into a life she never imagined claiming for herself. The outreach program Ellis had pitched took root faster than even he expected. Word spread through quiet channels, among vets' halls, old message boards, contractor support groups no one in officialdom bothered to check. Ava became a name people whispered when they needed someone who wouldn't flinch at the truth. Her office was small, a corner space in a converted municipal building with flickering overhead lights and a desk scarred by time. But the door had her name on it. Ava Carter, Director of Civilian Combat Support Services. And when survivors walked through it, she made sure they left knowing they weren't alone. Every face that came through that doorway carried a version of her own story. Scars that hadn't healed right, benefits denied, records misplaced on purpose, grief the government had filed under classified. Ava listened. She filed appeals, she fought, she made noise, and the system, creaky and vicious as it was, began to shift. It wasn't dramatic, no breaking of chains or crumbling walls. It was paperwork processed faster, a denied claim reversed, a forgotten name reinstated on a memorial wall. Small victories that meant everything to the people who'd lived as ghosts. Ellis kept his promise too. The lawsuits against Allied Force Solutions dragged on, but the pressure never let up. Board members resigned. A CEO stepped down. An internal whistleblower finally cracked, releasing the patents and field medevac protocols they'd stolen from Ava's unit. The press called it one of the largest veteran advocacy-driven exposures in decades. Ava didn't care about the headlines. She cared about the medics now getting the back pay they were owed, about Lena Duarte's mother receiving her daughter's citation in a public ceremony, about a kid named Devin, barely 23, walking into her office with fresh burns on his arm and leaving with a promise the world had once denied her. You matter. It was on the anniversary of Lewis Carter's death that the final reckoning came. They held a ceremony at Arlington, a modest one, no politicians, no cameras. Just the names of the fallen read aloud in the air, like a prayer meant only for those who'd know how to listen. Ava stood beside Brooks, her dress uniform jacket pressed clean. The badge they'd returned to her rested against her chest. When Lewis's name was called, Brooks squeezed her shoulder. They didn't speak, they didn't have to. After the last name, as taps played soft and lonesome, Ava stepped forward. At the base of a new memorial wall, engraved with names once lost to bureaucracy and indifference, she laid a simple dog tag. Lewis Carter. 5th Tactical Combat Medical Evacuation. Kandahar, 2010. She stood a long while after the others dispersed, because this, she realized, was what it meant to reclaim something stolen. Not revenge, not fame, but memory and power. To insist that your life, and the lives of those you loved, mattered, even when systems designed to forget them did their best to erase it all. To outlive the silence, to refuse to disappear. That night, back in her apartment, Ava opened her window and let the cool city air roll over her. Below, the world moved on, impatient, reckless, indifferent, and for once, she felt no need to chase it. The badge on her jacket hung by the door. The field medallion Brooks had saved for her rested beside a stack of new case files waiting for review. She'd spend tomorrow fighting again, and the day after that. But tonight, she allowed herself a moment to be still, to breathe, to exist, entirely and unquestionably, in the world she helped bend just a little closer to justice. A scarred waitress, a vanished medic, a voice no longer silent. Ava Carter, whole at last. As the final notes of that long fight faded, Ava's story settled not as a grand, triumphant ending, but as a testament that even the smallest act of defiance against erasure can carve a name into history's stone. And so it did, because she refused to be forgotten, and neither would those who followed. If this story of injustice and transformation moved you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more stories that turn pain into power.